The Commission will come to order, and I want to thank and welcome all of you to this very important hearing of the Commission on Security Cooperation in Europe. In September of 2011, hopes were raised high when the FBI announced that George Wright, a fugitive for over 41 years, had been located in Portugal and had been taken into custody pursuant to a provisional arrest from the United States, request from the United States. There were hopes for accountability, some justice, and for the family of the man he murdered in Wall Township in 1962 for at least some closure to a nightmare. In 1963, George Wright was convicted in connection with a gas station robbery during which Walter Patterson, a decorated World War II veteran and Bronze Star recipient, and that's him in that picture, obviously, was beaten and shot to death. Wright was subsequently sentenced to 15 to 30 years, but in 1970 escaped from Leesburg State Prison, now renamed Bayside State Prison, located in New Jersey. In 1972, he and 4 other men hijacked a Detroit to Miami flight. They flew the plane to Algeria, where Algerian authorities allowed them to disappear. In 1976, 4 of the hijackers were located and arrested in France. France refused to extradite them to the United States, but tried them in France instead. Following convictions, 2 of the hijackers spent a mere 3 years in prison, and 2 others spent 2.5 years. George Wright, however, was not among those caught. For 41 years, George Wright's whereabouts were unknown, and he built a life based on lies and deception. When George Wright was located in Portugal last year, the Patterson family naturally thought that, as a convicted felon and prison escapee, he would be speedily returned to the United States to finish serving the sentence he received for the murder of Walter Patterson. Portugal, after all, is a close ally committed to the rule of law and a long-standing extradition agreement with the United States. Shockingly, a Portuguese court rejected the United States extradition request last November, and efforts to reverse that decision have now apparently ceased. The Patterson family, so deeply wounded by the murder of their beloved family member and then by the murderer's escape, and now are bewildered and angry at Portugal's refusal to extradite George Wright. Today's hearing will examine what happened in this case, and it is the first in a series, and what could be done to promptly return Wright to an American prison, and the broader question it raises about the International Extradition System. On behalf of the Commission, I welcome Ann Patterson, Walter Patterson's daughter, who along with her family have suffered irreparable harm from the brutal violence committed against her beloved father by George Wright. Words are inadequate to convey my and the Commission's abiding respect, empathy, and condolences to you and your family on your excruciating loss and my disappointment, which I share with you, in Portugal. Ann will testify in part that the $70 that George Wright and Walter McGee stole wasn't enough. They had to beat my father, she says, beyond recognition. George Wright was identified by the imprints of the stock of his gun on my father's skin, she'll tell us. Her testimony is riveting. Her testimony opens up and gives us an insight into the enormous pain that she and the family have suffered. The Commission will also hear from R.J. Gallagher, a retired FBI agent who has done extensive work on the case, breakthrough work on the case, and has had an extraordinary career with the FBI. So we thank you, the Commission, for your service on behalf of all Americans for the wonderful law enforcement work you have done over the course of your lifetime. Finally, we will hear from Jonathan Winer, Senior Director of APCO Worldwide, Washington, D.C., and former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement. And also he worked for 10 years for Senator Kerry and has been tenacious working on law enforcement issues, particularly at state. On George Wright, Mr. Winer exposes the utter indefensibility of the Portuguese court's decision not to extradite George Wright, why Portugal can still do the right thing by revoking his citizenship, which he secured through immigration fraud, and how the U.S. can and must pursue Wright through Interpol and many other very important recommendations that I hope that the State Department, the Justice Department, Congress, all of us take to heart. Finally, let me note that the Commission had requested a representative of the Obama administration to be here to answer questions on what has and what can be done to bring George Wright to justice. The Commission was informed that Bruce Swartz, Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice, wasn't available for today's hearing. So on behalf of the Commission, I will reissue our request for Mr. Swartz or any other appropriate official from the administration to testify at a subsequent hearing. In like manner, the Commission invited the Portuguese ambassador, Nuno Brito, who was also unavailable due to a scheduling conflict, and like with Mr. Schwartz or whoever the administration would like to send, the Commission will request Ambassador Brito's testimony at a follow-up hearing that will be scheduled around his availability as well. Again, I'd like to now turn to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Cohen, and ask for any opening comments that he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm interested in hearing the testimony of the witnesses, and to Ms. Patterson, I express my regrets. It's been a long time, but to lose your husband. And the person who commits such a crime should be held responsible. And what he did in escaping and hijacking that plane is reprehensible as well. There is, from reading the record, there's obviously some positions that the Portuguese government is taking that seems to be adverse to what I think is common sense and international law and Helsinki Commission accords. And I hope that we can get to the bottom of the situation. But that what he did to your husband as an offense, an air piracy and hijacking, all of which should be extradition offenses, and the Portuguese government, I believe, don't want to prejudge it, but I believe should extradite him so that he answers for the crimes he's committed and the harm that he's done. So I look forward to the testimony and appreciate Mr. Smith bringing this hearing as he always does. And this is bipartisanship. While the Obama administration may not be here, I assure you that it's not because they're not interested, and this is bipartisan and that we're concerned about it as well. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for your comments. And I'd like to now introduce our witnesses, beginning first with Ann Patterson. And when we asked how she would like to describe, she just said daughter of Walter Patterson. And frankly, that is enough. A woman who has children and grandchildren, some of whom are here with us today, and a woman like her family has suffered irreparable harm. We'll then hear from Mr. Gallagher, who I mentioned earlier, is a former FBI special agent. From 1986 to 2011, retired just short of the 25 years. And he also served as an officer for the United States Navy for 5 years. And then, Jonathan, you'll be next if you would. And I just would point out a couple of things from his resume. He actually received a distinguished honor from the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, for his service in the State Department. The award stated that he created the capacity of the Department and the U.S. government to deal with international crime and criminal justice as important foreign policy functions, and that, quote, the scope and significance of his achievements are virtually unprecedented for any single official. So 3 very, very distinguished people, and if you could proceed.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Ann Patterson, and I am the daughter of Walter Patterson. My father was robbed, brutally beaten, and shot in his gas station in Wall Township, New Jersey, on November 23, 1962. He died of his injuries on November 25, 1962. I was 14 years old, and my sister Kay was 13. My father was a quiet, sensitive person. The gas station was his American dream, and he was so happy to be able to have his own business. He worked 16 to 18-hour days to support our family. Daddy's name is also on the Patterson Honor Roll of Soldiers, part of a family that has fought in all our country's wars. At age 21, he went to Europe and served our country for 4 years during World War II. He was a Tech 5 and a truck driver/mechanic, and was awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service. It was the day after Thanksgiving, and Daddy had come home for supper. It was about 4:30 when he got into his truck to go back to work. I stood at the kitchen window waving goodbye, and that was the last time I saw him alive. About 5 hours later, the phone rang and I answered it. Aunt Jenny said, "Walt's been shot," and I screamed, "No, no, no," and called my mother to the phone. I was crying, told my sister, and she started crying. My mother was not well. She called Uncle Charles to take her to the hospital. When she got there, she couldn't recognize my father. She later told us that they had beaten him to a pulp. The doctor operated from about 10:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. and told my mother he thought he had gotten all the bone fragments. When I asked her what Daddy had to say, she told me that he couldn't talk because his jaw was wired shut. He was wild with pain and could not be given anything for it since he had head injuries. He had to be restrained in the bed. The doctor told my mother that seizures were to be expected with this type of injury, and Daddy had a seizure on Saturday night. Kay and I had been scared to death to stay home alone on Friday night, so we rode to the hospital with Uncle Dick and Aunt Ginny as they took my mother to see Daddy on Saturday night. Aunt Ginny asked my mother if she had told us what we were going to see, but my mother did not allow us to see Daddy, and we waited in the car. Daddy was in critical condition, and no one except immediate family was allowed in. The doctor told my mother that if Daddy came through this, he would be a vegetable and need a lot of care. On Sunday evening, the doctor was talking to my mother in the hallway about my father's condition when the nurse came to them and told them that he had passed away. They allowed my mother to spend some time alone with him. When she came home, Uncle Dick and Aunt Ginny were each holding her arms and helping her to the house. I looked at Kay and I said, "Daddy died." The viewing was Tuesday, and the funeral home asked for a photo of Daddy so they could make him look like the picture. Does that sound odd to you? My father was unrecognizable in his casket. His wavy black hair with a touch of gray was replaced with straight black hair combed back. His face was all uneven and caked with makeup. I knew he was my daddy by looking at his hands. The $70 that George Wright and Walter McGee stole wasn't enough. They had to beat my father beyond recognition. George Wright was identified by the imprints of the stock of his gun on my father's skin. If there had not been such a beating, the doctors could have operated on the bullet wound to the abdomen, and it is quite possible that Daddy would still be with us today. For Kay and me, the nightmare was just beginning. Since our mother was not well, she could not take care of us. We were told later that we would be sent to Clinton, a home for wayward girls. I later found out that Clinton was, in fact, a prison for girls. There is something wrong with sending the victims to prison while the criminals do not have to be incarcerated for their actions. I thank God that Uncle Dick stepped in to take care of us. Our mother was very ill with a heart condition, and her death was hastened by losing Daddy. She passed away 15 months later, on February 26, 1964, leaving Kay and me orphaned. In our house lived my mother's aunt and uncle, both of whom passed away during that 15-month period. In just over a year, we experienced the deaths of all 4 people we lived with and lost our home. We were robbed of normal teenage years. There was no counseling available in 1962. We were left to deal with all this sorrow on our own. We tried to be strong for our mother while she was still alive. It has not been easy to relive all these events during the past 10 months. The FBI victim specialist suggested I see a counselor, which was beneficial to me. One of the problems that came out was the nightmares that I suffered from for years after my father's death. The counselor said that I had had post-traumatic stress after I described the nightmares to her. I also developed asthma and colitis within a few weeks of Daddy's death. The premeditated actions of the 4 individuals involved in my father's murder have negatively impacted 5 generations of the Patterson family. I've already spoken about my parents and my sister and me. My mother's uncle, who lived with us, refused food when he learned of this tragedy. He said, "I don't want to stay in a world where this is allowed to happen," and he died 4 months later. My grandfather never spoke my father's name again without crying and told me they didn't have to beat him up so bad. My father's 7 grandchildren were deprived of a loving grandfather, and they are angry at the injustice exhibited in the past 10 months. But the saddest to me are the hurt reactions of my father's 14 great-grandchildren. One of them saw the clip on TV of the capture and asked, "What is wrong with people?" not knowing it was about her great-grandfather. Another one curled up in a corner of the couch and crying asked if he could escape again. 5 generations of fear and hurt are 5 too many. George Wright cannot erase his life of crime. He is fraudulently a Portuguese citizen. 4 aliases do not change the fact that he was born George Edward Wright in the United States of America and committed crimes during his years here. When he chose the crime, he also chose the punishment, as they go hand in hand. George Wright did not give my father a choice on November 23, 1962, and so he should not have a choice about not serving his sentence. He does not owe Portugal time, he owes the United States. George Wright is not sorry for what he did. There has been no apology to the Patterson family. On the contrary, he has made this all about himself and basked in the limelight. To want to profit from a book and movie highlighting his heinous acts against the Patterson family is a slap in the face. He is not the victim here, we are. George Wright is a convicted murderer who lived a life of violence, then fled and lived a life of lies. Now his past has caught up with him, and he needs to come back here and serve his sentence. In light of all the recent media coverage, I have been approached by many people who have expressed their disgust towards this man and this situation. I feel it is a disgrace that our justice system has failed in assuring a proper punishment for this crime. This whole case sets a terrible precedent for this country, both here and worldwide. It is a negative towards decent citizens and a positive for criminals. The failure of extradition has affected us in the following ways. 1, fear of a known criminal on the loose. 2, fear of reprisal from criminal. Both of these fears are now 50 years long. 3, makes a mockery of the crime against my father. Did his life matter? 4, has perpetuated our pain and loss. 5, loss of any kind of confidence in the criminal justice system, from the local branch, which gave too lenient a sentence, to the state branch that put a convicted murderer on a minimum security work farm, to the federal branch, who have backed down to Portugal in the matter of extradition. The case was dropped before the final appeal was filed. It is one thing to do all you can, another to give up before you exhaust all avenues. I have asked if there are any other avenues of justice, such as withholding aid, and have not been given an answer. Don't we have a right to seek justice for our father? Our family has been emotionally affected by injustice in the following ways. 1, no closure. This is still an emotionally draining open wound. 2, we have family members and friends across this entire nation who are appalled at the injustice of trying to obtain justice. 3, we are not happy that George Wright wants to do a book and a movie and capitalize on his inhumane treatment of our father. 4, we were extremely upset when we read in the newspaper that the final appeal had been dropped. I was told that I would be notified of any decision so that I wouldn't be blindsided upon learning something from the media. 5, on a personal level, this has split my family in two. Some members support efforts to obtain justice, and some cannot emotionally face the details of this crime to even talk about it. What can be done? Here are my suggestions. Number 1, reinstate the death penalty for criminals convicted of heinous crimes. Such a strong penalty may act as a deterrent. 2, put pressure on Portugal. I understand there is an extradition treaty from 1907 to this effect. 3, do not send any financial aid to Portugal. 4, form a committee at the state level to double-check paperwork so that errors like this can't happen again. 5, support and pass Illinois Senator Richard Durbin's Bringing Fugitives to Justice Act. And 6, nothing that any of us say or do will bring my father back. But if we can look ahead and help the countless number of children who are similarly affected or will be affected by senseless crimes, then all of our efforts will not have been done in vain. There is no conclusion to my story. It has not occurred yet, for the conclusion now rests in the hands of the politicians. The FBI and the U.S. Marshals have done their job in locating this fugitive, and we thank them. I have done all I can by telling about our family events from November 23rd to November 25th, 1962, and the impact of this despicable crime. On behalf of the Patterson family, I ask you to please bring justice for the untimely death of my father, Walter Patterson. Thank you.
Ms. Patterson, thank you very much for that extraordinarily moving testimony and the tenacity that you have brought to trying to bring this man to justice, and for thanking the FBI and the Marshal Service for the extraordinary work they've done in tracking him down. We need to do our job, those of us in the executive as well as, in our case, the legislative branch, and I thank you for that. I'd like to now, we do have a vote on right now, but we do have some time. Mr. Gallagher, if you could proceed with your testimony, and thank you.
Yes. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is R.J. Gallagher. I'm a retired FBI agent, and at the risk of some redundancy, I'd like to acquaint members with the background of George Wright. On Friday night of Thanksgiving weekend in 1962, George Wright and two others robbed and mortally wounded Walter Patterson, a service station proprietor in Wall Township, New Jersey. That night, Wright and his co-defendants wore nylon stockings over their faces and wore gloves on their hands. Wright carried a sawed-off rifle, his co-defendant a cheap handgun. They brought with them white adhesive tape for binding of their victims. Earlier that same day, Wright and his co-defendants had cut down the rifle, bought ammunition, and had test-fired the weapon. They also had driven around the Jersey Shore area looking for prospective places to rob. At around 9:30 p.m. that night, when Wright and a co-defendant entered Walt Patterson's Esso gas station on Route 33, they were committing their second armed robbery of the night. This robbery, the one about to take place, unlike the first, did not go as planned. For it would appear that Walt Patterson was not sufficiently compliant or quick enough to the demands of the robbers, and a fight ensued. Wright and his co-defendant repeatedly rained blows to the head and shoulders of Walter Patterson with their weapons. At some point, the handgun carried by the co-defendant fired, and Walter Patterson was struck in the abdomen. He fell to the floor. The two robbers fled, taking with them about $70. Both robbers were very aware that their victim was shot and wounded, yet they left him alone on the floor of his gas station. They did not place an anonymous call to anyone to get Walter Patterson medical attention. Instead, using the money proceeds from their two robberies that evening, they went out and partied. They dined, they drank, and they played pool until 2 or 3 in the morning. Investigation over the next 2 days led to the identification and arrest of the persons involved in the robbery murder. This included George Wright. All the physical evidence was recovered: guns, stocking masks, gloves, ammunition. All the arrested gave full confessions. On January 28, 1963, Wright pled non-volt to a murder indictment. By this plea, Wright did not contest his guilt, and he waived his right to trial. This plea allowed Wright to receive a 30-year maximum sentence as opposed to life had he gone to trial and been convicted. On February 15, 1963, Wright was sentenced to a prison term of not less than 15 years and not more than 30 years. At this point, I'd like to just take a break from Wright's crime chronology and state that I've read in numerous media accounts subsequent to Wright's arrest that Wright has stated that since he did not fire the shot that killed Walter Patterson, he is not guilty of the crime of murder. First, both of Wright's co-defendants stated that in the immediate aftermath of this crime, Wright told them he had fired. 9 bullets from the sawed-off rifle Wright carried were found on the floor of the service station. The presiding judge at the time of Wright's sentencing went on record stating that these 9 rounds on the floor indicated Wright's intentions Wright's intention and attempt to fire his weapon, but that the weapon had malfunctioned. But regardless of Wright's intent, attempt, or belief that he had fired or that he had not fired, it was the law of the state of New Jersey that if a person committing a robbery kills another or death ensues during the robbery, that person is guilty of murder. I've also read that there is to be some mitigation for the crime when considering the age of George Wright, as he was 19 years old at the time. Here it should be noted that Walter Patterson, his victim, was barely a much riper 21 when he entered the U.S. Army shortly after Pearl Harbor. Walter Patterson then served in the Army for near 4 years until the war was over. Of his time in the Army, 2.5 years was spent over in Europe in the Eastern Theater of Operations. Back to the Wright timeline. On August 22, 1970, Wright and others escaped from the New Jersey State Prison. At this time, Wright had served 7 years, 7 months, and 25 days. Wright has remained a fugitive from U.S. justice since this date. On July 31, 1972, Wright and 4 others, to include one of the persons he escaped with, hijacked a Delta Airlines DC-8 en route from Detroit to Miami. The hijackers were accompanied by 3 of their small children. Wright was dressed in the garb of religious clergy. Wright was the eldest and the leader of the hijackers. He wielded a handgun, gave the orders, and issued the threats. He pointed a cocked weapon to the head of the airline pilot, Captain William May. Once landed in Miami, Wright demanded $1 million and threatened that if his demands were not met, he would toss bodies out of the plane. Wright and his fellow hijackers received the $1 million ransom, and they released approximately 80 passengers. The flight crew was not released and were forced to fly the plane and the hijackers first to Boston and then on to Algiers, Algeria. Algerian authorities seized the $1 million in the plane, returning them both to the U.S. The hijackers, however, were allowed their freedom and eventually made their way to France. Wright and the 4 other adults were all indicted for air piracy in the United States on August 3, 1972. While in Algeria, Wright and the other hijackers made a videoed press statement, and as part of that statement, the speaker stated, among other things, that the hijackers were revolutionaries. In May of 1976, 4 of the hijackers, the lone exception being George Wright, were arrested by French authorities for the 1972 air piracy. In 1978, France tried these 4 for the air piracy, and they were all convicted of same. And so to this day, Wright has not served his sentence for his homicide conviction, nor has he been tried for the indicted charge of air piracy. My involvement in this matter began in 1994, when I reopened the New Jersey fugitive investigation regarding Wright. I worked it until my retirement in July 2011. The United States Marshals and the New Jersey Department of Corrections joined the investigation in approximately 2003. Since the case was reopened, most all the techniques used in fugitive investigations were employed. These would include, but not be limited to, interviews, both domestic and abroad, notification to international law enforcement, court orders, human intelligence, cooperation of foreign law enforcement, specifically fingerprints, age-enhanced sketches, and computer images were produced and distributed. The United States Marshals commissioned the making of an age-enhanced bust. All 3 agencies played a vital and significant part in this investigation, and just as an aside, to my mind, it was a model of organic and ad hoc interagency cooperation. In March of 2010, the Portuguese police notified the FBI legal attaché in Madrid that they had positively identified the person living in Portugal under the name of Jose Luis Jorge dos Santos as George Wright. This they did unknown to Wright by comparison of photographs they had on file for Santos with those of George Wright. In September of 2010, 6 months after the positive identification, myself and attorneys from the Department of Justice, Office of International Affairs, met with Portuguese law enforcement and prosecutors in Lisbon, Portugal. The purpose of this meeting was for the United States to seek Portuguese legal input and to work together so that the United States might produce an extradition request with the greatest chance of success. I would characterize these meetings as both positive and productive. All the parties agreed that extradition could proceed for U.S. person George Wright. Further, there was agreement that George Wright was using a made-up name of Jose Santos and had in fact provided false pedigree information to the Portuguese government as regards to his name, place of birth, and parentage. One issue remained unresolved. Portugal saw as barrier to extradition Wright's exposure to a 25-year sentence of incarceration for an air piracy conviction. They viewed this as the equivalent of a death sentence, and therefore that would serve as basis for the denial. Moving along, well over a year had passed since the positive identification had been made, and this issue proved to be intractable, and no extradition request had yet to be submitted. In May of 2010, the decision was made to tender the extradition request based solely on Wright's homicide conviction. I participated in this decision and supported it fully. In fact, it was probably done at my instigation, so if hindsight determines this is a bad call, I am solely to blame. Portuguese law enforcement arrested George Wright in September of 2011. Since his arrest, the Portuguese courts have denied the United States extradition request for Wright. It is my understanding they cited the following in their ruling. 1, too much time had passed and there must be closure to criminal cases. 2, Wright's integration into Portuguese society demanded that extradition be denied on humanitarian grounds. Both these two reasons cited per DOJ are just not recognized as basis for denial of extradition per our treaty with Portugal. And third, the court found that Wright is a Portuguese citizen. This is where the matter now stands. Looking forward and beyond George Wright, each nation is free to choose its own criteria for citizenship. This is how it is and how it should always be. But it would seem that each nation would have self-interest in seeking an obligation from prospective citizens seeking naturalization for them to tell the truth regarding their identity and any information they give the government. This would obviously provide for the safety and security of the nation's own security. George Wright provided false information to Portuguese authorities, it would seem, because if he provided his true identity, not only would citizenship be denied, but he would probably be arrested. In August of 1972, George Wright was indicted on the criminal charge of air piracy. If one looks at the elements of the crime Wright committed, this same act committed today would potentially be charged as an act of terrorism. And for such a charge, the extradition treaty between U.S. and Portugal states that Portuguese citizens can and will be extradited for terrorism. I actually could not imagine that this crime taking place today would not be charged as terrorism. And specifically with return to George Wright, I've seen numerous media accounts post-arrest that suggest for some time he has led a good life and that he has in fact rehabilitated. This is perhaps a valid argument, and he might have a case for such. But there remains only one place that can decide if such an argument is valid, and that is here in the United States, where he committed his crimes in front of a court or a parole board of proper jurisdiction. I would encourage George Wright to come and make his argument. Thank you.
Mr. Gallagher, thank you so very much for that very extensive background, as well as for your work dating back to 1994. And Thank you so much for that. I'd like to now ask Mr. Winer if you would proceed with your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cohen, honorable members of the committee, as former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Law Enforcement, I'm honored to testify to share my views regarding the International Extradition System and options for the United States when a foreign legal system frustrates justice. I ask that my full written statement be placed in the record. During my tenure in the State Department and since, our government has worked to vindicate one underlying goal with regard to fugitives: to secure their return to the United States to provide justice regardless of the criminal's location. I have 10 points to make about how to apply this principle to the George Wright case and more generally. First, the decision by the Portuguese judge to refuse Wright's extradition to the United States is legally indefensible under the century-old U.S.-Portuguese extradition treaty and under the principles of extradition law internationally. Neither the passage of time nor Wright's citizenship through marriage provide a legitimate basis for the Portuguese judge to deny extradition, let alone humanitarian factors that have been asserted. This is simply legally wrong. The statute of limitations protects people from belated prosecutions, not fugitive escapees from prison after their convictions. It is also an abuse to refuse to extradite a citizen of another country who's escaped prison and only later becomes a citizen of the country to which he's fled. The judge's decision on these two issues is legally wrong, morally unjust, and should be given no respect whatsoever by any government beyond Portugal. 2. Portuguese authorities can still do the right thing to secure justice. Wright entered Portugal through immigration fraud, using a false name and with a false history about his citizenship and birth. It appears these true facts were not known to Portuguese authorities until 2010 or so. If this is correct, Portugal could revoke his citizenship and deport him, putting him on a plane to the United States or to another country which could turn him over to the United States. 3. The U.S. can take further steps on its own to use international institutions on this matter. George Wright is currently listed by the United States on Interpol's public wanted database as a fugitive, but the public notice is notably out of date. It doesn't list his current name, address, or other current personal details. This was as of yesterday. This new detailed data could all be provided to Interpol by the United States and made publicly available to every citizen of the world. The U.S. could ask Europol, Europe's police institution, to track him down and to arrest him if he ventures beyond Portugal. And FBI legal attachés could make the same request with their EU counterparts. 4. The U.S. has a reward program for the rendition of important fugitives. One part of that's administered by my former bureau, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. The State Department could issue a reward for information or other assistance that secures the return of Wright to the United States. A reward might lead to a citizen's arrest, in which people grab him and put Wright into U.S. custody. This approach has been upheld by the Supreme Court. Indeed, the Justice Department's internal procedures expressly allow the use of bounty hunters and rewards. 5th, the U.S. can itself use lures to entice a criminal fugitive to leave a foreign country so he or she can be arrested in international waters or airspace or brought to the United States or in a third country for subsequent extradition, expulsion, or deportation. There are a wide range of possibilities for lures potentially applicable to Wright. How will he know whether a book agent or movie agent is real and intends to help him publicize his life, or is actually an agent of the United States? I hope he has a lot of trouble making that distinction in the days to come. 6th, the United States could undertake an extraordinary rendition in which U.S. government officials take direct action to capture a terrorist, which Wright was, such as snatching Wright as he's going about his day-to-day business, smuggling him into a car and then to a boat, and then bringing him to the United States to face justice. Notably, the use of such techniques risks significant protests on the part of a foreign government, such as Portugal, and can chill the bilateral relationship. This happened when we did it in a very important case in Mexico. We did the right thing. The Mexicans were angry, but it was the right thing to do. after they tortured and killed a Drug Enforcement Administration agent. And it happened recently in Italy in connection with some renditions. But we can still do it if we choose to. 7, the U.S. could apply terrorist economic sanctions to Wright, prohibiting transactions with him by any U.S. person and freezing any assets he may have in any U.S. financial institution. Now, he may not have it in any U.S. financial institution, but foreign financial institutions often then apply these sanctions as well to protect themselves. And it will certainly inhibit his ability to gain any economic advantage from his life story. As he stated publicly, he hopes to write a book about his life and secure a film deal. U.S. imposition of terrorist sanctions against him would make it much more difficult for him to sell the book and to profit off his crimes, and might make it possible for profits from any of these ventures could be seized by the United States. 8, the U.S. could take steps to punish Portugal for its court's unjust refusal to extradite Wright. Unfortunately, I believe this approach almost certainly would be counterproductive in practice. We have all kinds of security arrangements with Portugal. The Portuguese government did not do the wrong thing, as near as I can tell here. A Portuguese judge did, a different part of the Portuguese government. And for that reason, were I in the State Department, I would not support sanctions against Portugal. Regardless, senior U.S. officials can be directed to raise this issue with Portuguese counterparts, inviting positive steps by Portugal, such as denaturalization and deportation, to secure justice, and I certainly hope they do that. 9, Congress could strengthen the executive branch's ability to analyze and apply these tools in cases of failed extraditions, such as this one. This could be facilitated through a congressional mandate for an annual report on extraditions to Congress, covering such issues as total extraditions by country, number of extraditions refused, reasons for refusal of extraditions, and steps taken by the United States in response to a refused extradition. Such a report might provide for further focused attention on these issues by both the executive branch and by Congress, thereby facilitating the goal of securing justice for all. I understand any administration might resist putting such information in one place publicly in order to protect confidential intelligence, diplomatic, and law enforcement programs, activities, and relationships. For this reason, Congress may wish to consider structuring any such mandate to provide for a public report that delivers statistical data and information in a classified publicly with information on certain matters in a classified appendix. Finally, and I know you're facing a vote, we're okay? Okay. Finally, the U.S. should not give up on this case simply because an extradition has failed. A fugitive may be able to run, but should never be permitted to hide. George Wright has expressed his relief at not being returned to the United States to serve out his prison sentence and being allowed to spend the remainder of his life with his wife and his grown children while profiting off his crimes by writing a book about them and seeking a film deal. Walter Patterson and his entire family have been denied such pleasures and their fundamental human rights by Wright and his own personally chosen criminal acts. In this case, and in other cases like this, U.S. policy and the actions our government takes must make sure that murderers and terrorists, wherever located, can never breathe the sigh of relief that they've reached safety as a result of outlasting law and justice. Which of the options I've outlined should be taken in this case will depend on careful judgments by those in the U.S. government with the most knowledge of the facts about what steps will be most likely to actually succeed to secure justice here. The committee may contribute to that process further through ongoing dialogue with those who have those responsibilities, including sending specific questions to relevant components of the U.S. government about their intended actions on this case now that extradition has failed. I'm available to respond to any questions you may have, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Winer. Let me just ask you if I could first, of your 10 points, what points, if any, have been pursued by the Justice Department or by state?
Based on the public record, it does not appear any steps other than the extradition. Mr. Gallagher may have more information than I do, and that's one reason why further inquiry from the committee may be of value.
Mr. Gallagher, are you aware of any other efforts made besides extradition?
No, I'm not. As of my retirement, I'm no longer in the loop.
Okay. Again, we had asked that the administration be here due to a scheduling conflict or not, but we will ask that question and many others in open hearing as well as by way of letter. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Schwartz at the Justice Department is a person I've worked with in the past for whom I have the highest possible regard for his integrity, competence, diligence, creativity, imagination, knowledge. And I think that working with him on this matter would be as fruitful as it could possibly be in light of his institutional responsibilities.
Knowing what you know, having worked as a DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Law Enforcement, is the decision made at his level or would it be made at a higher level?
I think the answer to that question is yes and yes, which is to say Mr. Schwartz exercises a lot of influence, and he should. He's a person of great judgment and experience. In this matter and all of these kinds of matters, the State Department has its equities. It wants to maintain a good relationship with Portugal, which, as I said, this was a judicial decision, not an executive branch decision. It's going to want to think about precedent. The Justice Department has had a lot of experience with such problems as extraordinary rendition over the past decade. And so there'll be more than one component of the U.S. government that would likely be involved in this kind of process.
We have heard that before. We've heard it recently in the case of a child who was abducted to Brazil, and the equities were such that very little was being done to bring David Goldman's son, Sean, back. It was on a list of talking points, but hardly a priority. We hear it often. It seems to me that from the Portuguese point of view, there should at least be some consideration being given as to what this does to the other side of that equation, and that is what Americans, what the American government, with the Congress, and hopefully what the executive branch thinks of what appears to be a rogue court. As you said, I think, Mr. Gallagher, so well, questions could be asked, but the final adjudication needs to be done here, where the crime and the conviction and the sentencing and the incarceration were all done in a very lawful manner, and no one questions whether or not the rule of law was followed in this case. And yet some rogue, seemingly rogue judge is able to do this, and there will be repercussions, respectfully, I would say, from this side vis-a-vis Portugal.
Mr. Chairman, from my perspective, when Congress takes an interest in an issue like this, it can motivate elements of our government to do more. And the instinct of the government ordinarily in the executive branch is to deal with the crisis of the day and the underlying goals of maintaining relationships and working problems. Making this a priority is an important part of the congressional mission and does have an impact, a positive impact on executive branch functionality in terms of protecting Americans. And it can make a very big difference in strengthening the ability of the executive branch to protect Americans, as is the case here.
And that is part of what the hope is here, that this begins an introspection as to whether or not we're doing all our due diligence to protect Americans everywhere. I just came back from Bolivia just a few weeks ago on a case of a man named Jacob Ostreicher, who has been charged with nothing, languishes in Palomacero prison with no charges brought against him. The welfare and whereabouts aspect of what state has done, or the consular affairs people, is tremendous, but it has not been raised to the level of government to government in a way, has not gone to the undersecretary, has not gone to the secretary or any higher. I asked that question specifically. So we're making, hopefully, a big deal about that, not just for Jacob, although that should be enough, but for any other American who was improperly and unethically incarcerated and is made to suffer. And that, Ms. Patterson, is in part what we're trying to do here. One, and I think this is something that is often missed by some in government, and that is the ongoing trauma that you and your family has experienced. This is not over. And there are 3 impact statements that some of the younger relatives, the daughters, would submit, are going to submit for the record. As you said, 5 generations of traumatizing, and for this man to remain at liberty, thumbing his nose at the world, especially at your family and at the United States, having been incarcerated. And all the good work that was done by the FBI. Mr. Gallagher, thank you for that tremendous work, taking this up in 1994. And I'm wondering, having worked with the Portuguese, is this a pattern? Have you detected anything that would even suggest that this is the way the Portuguese government acts, or is this an aberration?
this was my lone attempt at extradition with Portugal. I can say that when we met with them and Department of Justice, they were the law enforcement. They were the ones that, at our behest, made the positive identification and were bending over backwards to help us, as were the Portuguese prosecutors. And I would defer that to me, it looks like a sole judge in the judiciary over there that has just made a bad call.
Now, is there a higher level of court that can overrule him? Is that in the process? And did the United States meet its timeline and to appeal and to try to bring this to the next level?
Mr. Chairman, I don't understand the final moments of this case in which the United States government apparently did not do a final appeal. I know that the Office of the Legal Counsel at the Department of State or the Office of International Affairs in the Department of Justice would most likely have been involved in making a determination on that. Both of these offices, in my experience, regardless of administration, Republican, Democrat, over decades, are diligent and honorable and pay attention, first and foremost, to the legal equities of Americans, American citizens, and the U.S. government. And while other parts of the government may have other equities, I want to maintain a great relationship with a country of A, B, or C. These offices are very focused on those points, so it's a factual thing to clear up with them. I can tell you point blank, Portugal and the United States have maintained over many decades close working law enforcement as well as military security relations that have advanced U.S. security and law enforcement goals over a long time. These are not just valued allies in a cliched sense. They're valued allies in a day-to-day operational sense. And I do not blame the country for what this judge did, just as any number of American judges have made decisions with which I vehemently disagree and do not control.
This hearing is not the beginning. When Ms. Patterson came and asked me to look into this, I got on the phone immediately and began the process, and then knew in a timely fashion that an appeal had to be filed. And so, they certainly were on notice that, something should have been done sooner rather than let a deadline pass, which is, again, why we had hoped the Justice Department would be here to give us, maybe we're missing something.
Congress should have an explanation from the executive branch on this.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes,
Mr. Chairman, I'll give you my sense of it, and that is, as I've been informed, that the appeal could the Department of Justice hired private attorneys in Portugal, and the Portuguese prosecutors, for whatever reason, and the reason I don't know, chose not to go ahead with the appeal on their side. The court ruled that the private attorneys hired by Department of Justice could not go forward on their own without a file of appeal by the prosecutors, and that's what I know. I can't explain it, but
okay, Mr. Winer.
Attorneys regularly in this world don't think of all contingencies, or to be more precise, more blunt, screw up. And if Mr. Gallagher's account is correct, it may be that inadequate consideration was given by the Justice Department to this possibility. These things can happen, and in this case, the result is a travesty. This is unjust. This is a travesty. This is wrong. This should be turned around, and the United States government should be taking whatever steps are appropriate to get this turned around.
Your point number 8, and I thank you for that emphatic statement. You mentioned that senior U.S. officials can be directed to raise this issue with Portuguese counterparts, inviting positive steps by Portugal, such as denaturalization and deportation, to secure justice. Has that been done?
I have no information as to whether it's been done in this case. It may well be that because the extradition process was going forward, this option was not previously considered. It should be. If he, as every fact seems to indicate, committed any form of fraud in Portugal that allowed him to become a citizen, certainly under core principles of immigration law, you can seek a denaturalization as a prelude to deportation. And this is done, it can be done, it has been done in other cases, and it certainly should be actively explored in this case. If that doesn't work, you've got lures, you've got extraordinary renditions, you've got bounty hunters and rewards. Those are all options.
Mr. Gallagher, you, and it must have been agonizing to recommend that the air piracy charges be dropped so that this conviction and the way would be paved to bring this man back to serve for having murdered Mr. Patterson. Could you just elaborate a little bit on how hard that had to have been? I mean, air piracy is an extraordinary and egregious crime, and yet you saw this, garnering justice in this case to trump that. You triaged it.
I can answer that, in that it didn't seem like we were getting anywhere with respect to submitting an extradition request, and that it was going to be denied. There's practical law enforcement reasons in that he's been positively identified for close to a year and a half, and sitting on a fugitive for a year and a half is interminable. Just the chance that he finds out that somebody's looking at him or for him, he could certainly pick up that information by a chance visit to his local police station where they've been notified, hey, the guy down the road is really a U.S. fugitive, or a chance traffic violation. So sitting a year and a half is a very long time to do. So we sought resolution. I don't know that the air piracy thing is dead, but at the time it was severed.
You, Mr. Winer, pointed out that the Interpol information was, to this, as of yesterday, I think you said, was out of date. That's unconscionable. This man is a flight risk this instant. Why couldn't that be corrected?
I was stunned to find it listed as George Wright without a pseudonym, to list the old information without updates, and I do not understand it.
How hard, Mr. Gallagher, is that to update?
I know it can be updated. I hadn't queried it recently, so.
Mr. Winer?
It can be updated in an hour. It can be updated in 2 hours. It should not take more than 24 hours from this hearing to be updated.
Now, is it possible that Mr. Wright, if he thought that the Portuguese government might do something to expedite the extradition, that he could, as we're talking, be a flight risk or leave Portugal to go to a non-extradition country?
There are any number of things that he could do. He could go back to Algeria, I suppose, where apparently he started out his adventure. He could go to, where was he in Africa, Mr. Gallagher?
Guinea-Bissau.
Guinea-Bissau, and hang out in Guinea-Bissau, if he wants to do that. The United States could then pursue him throughout the world. Why not?
Mr. Cohen.
Thank you. First of all, Ms. Patterson, I think I've errantly referred to you as the widow, and you're obviously the daughter, but it's been such time, and I wasn't familiar with it. But I appreciate your testimony. I'm sorry your father was a hero, and whether he was or wasn't, his murder should be apprehended. But particularly in light of what he did and served his country, has our State Department or anybody from the United States government contacted you? Have you had contact with anybody in this matter recently?
I had, besides Congressman Smith, I had contacted Senator Lautenberg's office, and they had put in a couple of requests for me, and they did requests from the state, the Department of Justice, and I do have copies of those letters that I will submit to the record too. So I did hear from the State Department. I have written a letter to Secretary of State Clinton, and I did get a letter back from there about 6 months later. So I do have those two.
And what was the response?
From the State Department, they were aware of it, and they were wanted justice also, and they were going to be working on it. And from the Department of Justice, they said that they had been advised by their lawyer not to go for the last appeal because it wouldn't matter. They would still be denied. So they would be looking at other avenues also.
Mr. Winer, and I presume you'd be the right person to ask this, a couple of questions. First, are there other fugitives that Portugal has refused to extradite to our country that you're familiar with?
No, the only case that I'm familiar with is a case that's decades old in which the U.S. refused to extradite someone to Portugal, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court, having to do with nationality exclusions, and became a big precedent in extradition law. But this is not a pattern to the best of my knowledge.
And you don't think that the judge there would have had that in the back of his mind?
No.
It's not a case that's a burning issue with people. Do you know anything about this judge and his or her history and background? And
I do not, sir.
No. And the judge is what type of judge is it? Do you know?
I do not.
No. The Portuguese judiciary is it known to be above board?
It's considered to be independent, and like most Western European judiciaries, it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Imperfect, but pretty good. And again, in the United States, there are any number of decisions that judges make that I've disagreed with over the years. It's difficult to enforce rule of law in a fair and honorable way in all cases. Travesties occur. This is a travesty and an outrage.
Has anybody from the Portuguese government, I know it's a separate branch and all that, expressed in any way their concern about the decision of the judge, or any action that they might think was appropriate, or they've been pretty moot on it?
That's a question that you would have to ask the United States government or Mrs. Patterson about.
Do either Mrs. Patterson or Mr. Gallagher know of any statement that the government might have made? Any concern, issue?
No, I'm not worried.
Not at all. Rendition's an interesting concept. You brought it up, Mr. Winer. Which branch of our government does this? Is it
Renditions have been done in recent years by intelligence agencies.
Yes,
with involvement under some certain circumstances of the military or other security elements of the United States government. The law enforcement agencies take the point of view that they do not ask how someone came under U.S. jurisdiction. That's not important. Their role is to deal with people once they're under U.S. jurisdiction.
It's a results test.
Other components of the United States government are involved in the rendition process, or private citizens in connection with rewards programs.
And it's a rare that this is used, to the best of your knowledge?
It was rare when I was in the government. My understanding is it was less rare in the Bush administration during the period post 9/11, and it appears the current administration has moved more towards the use of other mechanisms rather than renditions to deal with terrorists. The drone program would be one example of that.
Rendition to the nth.
Rendition to another place.
Yes, indeed. Is Wright hiding out, or is he pretty open and notorious in Portugal now? Do we know? Mr. Gallagher, you have any idea?
By all media, he's living in his same residence and open.
So somebody could go over there and bring him to justice or whatever. Do you know how long he's been married? How long he's had citizenship?
No, I do not.
Yeah. It's an amazing story. I appreciate Mr. Smith bringing this to the commission. It is a terrorist act. I think I remember this. It's 72. I'm that old. During that time, there were quite a few hijackings, and we were all concerned about flying. And would you end up in Cuba? A lot of them went to Cuba. But I remember this Algeria thing and going to Miami and Boston and the whole scene. And so I guess I remember this case. And it did make people leery of flying, and it's certainly a terrorist act and something that shouldn't just be forgotten about. I mean, we should find justice. I've been I'm proud to be a member of the Judiciary Committee, as well as this commission. But in the Judiciary Committee under Chairman John Conyers, we did a lot of successful legislation to see that perpetrators of civil rights crimes were brought to justice, even though the many years had transpired since the crime had been committed. And I think in all those circumstances, the perpetrators should be brought to justice, for the crime they did was against society. And in this situation, it's the same. And I don't find the judge's decision that there's any kind of a lapse, a breach, because of time should work. Latches shouldn't be applied, statute of limitations or anything like that. And we should take a position that we get involved. So I'd like to plan to join with Mr. Smith. I did not have the opportunity to do it in the past, but if he does another entreaty to the State Department, and I feel confident that he will, I would like to join with him in that, in whatever efforts we do. So it is bipartisan. And I believe that we should continue action to see that this gentleman is brought to justice, because what he's done was wrong to your family, it was wrong to the United States of America, it was wrong to the justice system. So I appreciate the hearing, the testimony, and I regret what you and I presume these granddaughters here?
2 granddaughters and 2 of my daughters.
Well, I'm sorry about you. You had a great grandfather. And your mother's doing a great job, but to remember that legacy. We should never forget the legacy, and we should always remember and try to find justice. In the Jewish religion, the Holocaust, never forget, and you don't forget your family. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will work together on requesting additional actions by the State Department and Justice Department. Let me ask, we have 3 impact statements, and I know, and without naming each person, because I know that that's a concern, I would like, if any of the granddaughter, or daughters, I should say, would like to, and granddaughter, say a word or 2 or a paragraph from their impact statement. The entire statement will be put in the record. And while you're thinking about that for a moment, Mr. Winer, you made a very excellent point about Congress should strengthen the executive branch's ability to analyze and apply these tools in cases of failed extraditions. And you proposed that we get a report, and we will follow up with some legislation pursuant to your excellent recommendation that would cover total extraditions by country, number of extraditions refused, reasons for refusal of extraditions, and steps taken by the U.S. in response, and that's the one we really would look forward to, in response to a refused extradition. We don't have the data. We don't get the information. There's a lack of compiling it, and I think your recommendation is a good one. Thank you for that. Would anyone like to say a word, please? No need to say your name.
A couple paragraphs? You don't want the whole thing? Should I read the whole thing, or? Sorry.
Whatever you like to do.
Okay.
Whatever you like to do, please.
Okay. I am not sure I will ever know the full impact of never meeting my grandfather, Walter Patterson, but I can speculate how things could have been. I imagine that he would have spent time with his grandchildren as we grew up, visiting us, playing with us, spending holidays with us, or going to our weddings, meeting his great-grandchildren. I am sure he would have told us his war stories and life adventures, but we will never know his story as told by Walter Patterson. If my grandfather hadn't been murdered, I think my grandmother would have lived longer to enjoy the above-mentioned activities with her grandchildren. George Wright took both of them away from us. Even though George Wright denies firing shots, it was not a bullet that killed my grandfather. He died from severe head trauma inflicted on my grandfather by George Wright. Beating a man who was a decorated World War II veteran while he was down is a cowardly act. It's time for George Wright to grow up and be a man and face punishment for the violent, disgusting crime he committed. Wright chose his actions. Now he needs to pay the price for them. One of the biggest impacts of living without my grandfather was financial hardship. He was a gas station owner who probably would have had financial security to pass along to my mother. Instead, she had her father and all that he had to offer taken away. My mother had to start with nothing. Therefore, times were extremely difficult for us as we grew up. I started babysitting and taking care of neighbors' pets when I was in 5th grade to earn some money. I used that money to buy a car. As soon as I was old enough to drive, I went to work after school each day and on weekends to pay for car insurance, gas, and clothes. If I needed something, I knew I had to pay for it. After high school, I had to work 2 jobs while going to college full-time. I had to pay my own tuition. I had to pay for my own wedding. My parents simply didn't have the means to help their children with these things. If my grandfather had been alive, he could have watched us when we were little, so my mom could have gone to work to help out financially. My parents did the best they could just to put food on the table for us. My dad hunted, so we ate a lot of venison. There were no extras or luxury items. We wore hand-me-downs and were taught to be happy with what we had. My parents wouldn't have needed to struggle if my grandfather had been there to help. My grandfather wasn't here to help due to George Wright's senseless crime. Whatever happened in the hospital when my mom went to see her father as he was dying caused her to not be able to go to hospitals anymore. She has 11 grandchildren, 12 now, that she was unable to see when they were born, not until they came home. My daughter was in the special care nursery for 10 days when she was born. Luckily, she was okay, but my mom may have never seen her granddaughter alive. I split my head open as a child and had to wait for a ride to the hospital to get stitches because my mom couldn't take me to the hospital and my dad was at work. He worked as many hours as he could just to make ends meet. It is difficult to speculate how things would have been if my grandfather hadn't been murdered, but his presence could have only made life easier and better for all of us. George Wright turned my mother's life upside down, and 5 generations of the Patterson family have been negatively affected. Wright has lived a full life, while my grandfather's life was senselessly taken away. Wright should be thankful for the time he has had with his family. At least he has the opportunity to say goodbye to his wife and kids as he leaves to serve his sentence. My grandfather wasn't given that courtesy. George Wright's fate is a result of his own choices and actions. My grandfather was an innocent man trying to make an honest living. He fought for our country and for our freedom. In return, he was beaten to death by George Wright. Please provide justice for my grandfather, Walter Patterson, and extradite George Wright to the United States to finish serving his sentence for the brutal beating and murder of my grandfather. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Get away with murder. To some, it's just an expression, but to others, a reality. 49 years ago, a little girl of 14 years old received a horrifying phone call. On the other end was a distraught family member calling to notify a woman that her husband had been brutally attacked and shot. The 14-year-old was the recipient of this message and was told nothing except, "Walt's been shot." Walter was her father, who 2 days later had vanished from her life forever. It sounds like a movie or storyline for a perfect mystery book series. To my family and myself, it's the harsh reality of the world we live in. My mother is that 14-year-old girl, and Walter Patterson is the grandfather I never met. From what I understand and conclude from stories told, he was a hard-working family man. He had risked his life in the U.S. Army, fighting for the freedom of the people in the country in which we reside. Going to battle and sustaining injuries during combat isn't what took him from his family. It was the appalling choice of some of the very Americans he was fighting for. It was a moment that would change the lives of many people. On the night of November 23, 1962, Walter Patterson was working at a gas station he ran. It was an innocent night's work, and he was making a living to provide for his family, who consisted of a wife and 2 young daughters. When a car of 4 individuals pulled around the back of the shop, an average workday would soon take a turn for the worse. Little did my grandfather know, he'd soon be faced with individuals garbed with stockings on their heads and equipped with guns in their hands. What began as a robbery ended in murder. The individuals who set out with the intentions of killing had succeeded. Luckily, our justice system had been victorious in apprehending these individuals and convicting them for the crime they committed. Walter Patterson can't be brought back to watch his 2 daughters blow out their birthday candles, hang Christmas lights with his family, or carve the Thanksgiving turkey. He would never be able to participate in daddy-daughter dances, walk his daughters down the aisle on their wedding day, or enjoy the births of their children. But at least the creatures responsible for this would pay for what they've done. Or would they? 7 years of a prison sentence was apparently all that one of these cowards, a man by the name of George Wright, could handle. As if choosing to participate in a murder wasn't enough of a poor choice, his life of crime wouldn't stop there. Mr. Wright had the brilliant idea to steal the prison warden's car to make his great escape. Being a criminal obviously came easy to this individual because his law-breaking actions didn't stop there. What does a convicted murderer do after he breaks out of prison? Well, this particular criminal chose to expand his criminal record by hijacking a passenger plane, putting yet more lives at risk, and making a mockery of the FBI. He managed to collect $1 million in ransom money, which he demanded be delivered by FBI agents in their underwear or swimsuits. One would think if this murderer were to be caught, he'd really be in serious trouble with all these actions he carried out. For many years, George Wright lived his life. He even got married and had a family of his own. Were the images of a beaten and shot man ever present in his mind? Did he ever think about the lives of those family members that were torn apart on that day that he chose to act like a man of no feelings or regard for human life? When he was counting his illegally obtained $1 million, was he picturing 2 young girls standing over a coffin, painfully watching their young, brave father be buried? Was he thinking of the young single mother who was left to deal with her newly broken family? I doubt it, and George Wright was actually running like a coward while conspiring about how he would be able to live the good life himself. No conscience, remorse, or regret has ever been evident by this individual's actions. He must have felt he had something to hide, proven by the fact that he illegally and unofficially changed his name and remained in a country half a world away from where he destroyed Walter Patterson and his family. 41 years have passed by. After diligent searching and a refusal to put this case file back in the file cabinet, the FBI was hopeful that they had found this murderer and fugitive. That 14-year-old girl who received that devastating phone call is now 63 years old and has received yet another phone call regarding the murder of her father. Only this time, the phone call was of a positive nature. The news of this armed robber, murderer, prison escapee, plane hijacker, and fraud being caught seems surreal. After all these years, this man will finally pay the price for the crimes he chose to commit. The life of Walter Patterson can't be brought back. Knowing that justice will be served and that George Wright literally won't get away with murder will help to close the door on this devastating chapter of Walter Patterson's family's lives. Protecting and hiding a known convicted criminal is considered a crime in itself. Portugal, the place in which George Wright chose to flee to and hide out at, like the coward he is, chose to protect him by refusing extradition. How can an average individual be punished for hiding out a criminal, yet here you have the government of a country harboring this fugitive and getting away with it? When this news hit our family, many emotions were felt. The feelings of anger, sadness, and frustration are overwhelming. A convicted killer and fugitive has been caught, but is being protected from the law. The rationale is now that he is a Portuguese citizen, and therefore they feel the need to protect him. Never mind the fact that Walter Patterson had no protection from this individual's hands, but in hindsight, is George Wright even a legitimate Portuguese citizen? He used criminal acts to access the country and used a fraudulent family background and name to obtain his so-called citizenship. George Wright has not become a Portuguese citizen, but rather the pseudo-individual he created has. One would think a government would want to rid their country of crime and corruption, but Portugal is protecting an individual who has brought these things to them. Portugal isn't the only country to blame for this monster having the ability to move on with his life, as if his hands were not a murder weapon at one time, as if his own mind didn't tell him to commit the various crimes of a hateful, malicious monster. The very country that Walter Patterson received numerous medals for protecting is contributing to George Wright literally getting away with murder. The country in which immigrants travel far and wide to reach to obtain a better life for themselves, our very own United States of America, has given up on one of its own. The decision has been made that a human life that was taken illegally by the hands of another isn't worth pursuing justice for. Members of our Attorney General's office have decided that no more appeals are necessary in the attempt to extradite this convicted murderer so justice can be served. It would be very interesting to see if the same decision would be made if the individual who was prematurely buried carried one of their last names. This war veteran fought for the freedom of citizens of the United States. The government was unable to protect him from George Wright while he was still alive. The least that the United States could do is return the fight that he gave and express the need to have this man brought back to where this crime was committed. In public schools across the nation, hundreds of students and staff proudly recite the Pledge of Allegiance. It would be reassuring to know that these aren't just words, but actually have true meaning, and that our country stands by the last line of this pledge. If nothing else, this country should have the ambition to send the message that the United States is just that, united. Thank you.
Thank you. Remarkable words and convictions, heart, courage from 3 remarkable women. Mr. Patterson would be so proud. We will continue our efforts diligently. The hearing is adjourned.